Hello students, today we are going to study French Revolution, one of the very important topic of world history. The French Revolution in 1789 is one of the few historical events that have changed the history of human beings. It is on after the French Revolution that the suppressed people all around the world started talking about human freedom, fraternity, rights, etc. So here is a gist of the chapter. The French society during the late 18th century. In this, King Louis XVI of the Bourbon family was barely 20 years old when he ascended the throne of France. He was married to Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette. Now, the new king, upon accession, found the treasury empty. The financial resources of France had drained because of the long years of war and cost of maintaining a lavish court at the huge palace of Versailles. So, two reasons were there. One was the maintenance of a lavish court, and the other reason was long war. Now, the 13 colonies were helped by France. The 13 colonies of America were helped by France under Louis XVI to gain their independence from Britain, their common enemy. This added another 1 billion livre to the already existing debt of 2 billion livre. Means they were already under debt. So the lenders who loaned money to the state now started charging 10% of interest. So this forced the French government to spend higher percentage of its budget in paying interest charges alone. The government was left with no other alternate but to increase the taxes to meet the expenses of maintaining an army, the court, the government offices, universities, etc. Yet even increasing the tax did not help the government much. Thus, in the 18th century, the French society was divided into three estates. These were known as the First Estate, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate of France. The clergy constituted the First Estate, the nobility, the Second Estate, and the bulk of French people, the Third Estate. So the first two estates were privileged ones. They enjoyed all the favors and rights and were not required to pay any tax to the state. The clergy had the right to collect tithes, and the nobles to extract feudal dues in their respective territories. Only members of the third estate, which comprised of the poor peasants, paid taxes. So the society of estate was part of the feudal system since Middle Ages, which was termed as the old regime and described as society and institutions of France before 1789. Peasants, the members of the third estate, had to render services to the lord, working in his houses and fields, serving in army, and by participating in building roads. They were obliged to pay tithe and a tax levied by the church to the church, and finally they had to pay taxes to the state also. It was basically the third estate that had to bear the burden of financing activities of the state by paying taxes. These included a direct tax called taille and indirect taxes that were levied on a number of articles of daily use like salt and tobacco. Next comes the struggle to survive. The increase in population of France from about 23 million people in 1715 to 28 million people by 1789 led to a rapid rise in the demand for food grains. Since the production of grains was not so much as the demand, the prices of bread, the staple food of the majority, shot up quickly. Most of the people who worked as laborers in workshops received fixed wages from their employers. There was no parity or between the fixed wages and the rising prices. On the other hand, a wide gap started developing between the rich and the poor. The things worsened to something subsequent that kept on occurring frequently in France during the old regime. Next is a growing middle class contemplate an end to privileges. Peasants and workers, though, had taken part in revolts in the past against increasing taxes, food scarcity, and soaring prices. Soaring prices means the high prices, but they had lacked plans and means for carrying out full-scale measures to bring about a change in the social and economic order. So to achieve this goal, it was left to those people within the third estate who got prosperous and had access to education and innovative ideas. The emergence of social groups called the middle class was witnessed in the 18th century. They earned their wealth by manufacturing goods such as silk, textiles, and by either exporting through an expanding overseas trade or by selling these to the richer members of the society. The third estate comprised of professionals, lawyers, administrative officials, etc., in addition to the manufacturers and merchants. And the educated, all of them were of the firm belief that none of the groups in the society should be privileged by birth. Rather, meant that it should be the criteria of a person's social position. So, philosophers like Locke and Rousseau supported the idea of envisaging a society that is based on freedom, equal laws, and opportunities for all. John Locke even sought to rebut the doctrine of divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau put forward an idea proposing a form of government based on a contract between the people and their representatives. Montesquieu, in the book The Spirit of Laws, proposed a division of power. The power divided between the government and the three pillars of the government, that is, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. The model of the government was adopted in USA after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain. For political thinkers in France, the American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights was an important example. So, the thoughts of these philosophers were circulated through newspapers and books and discussed intensively in saloons and coffee houses. For the benefit of those who could neither read nor write, these thoughts were frequently read aloud in groups. The spread of news that Louis XVI was about to impose another dose of taxes to meet out the state expenses angered the people, and they protested against the system of privileges. Now, the outbreak of French Revolution. Louis XVI called an assembly of Estates General, that is a political body to which third estate that the representative to pass proposal for new taxes. So the first two estates sent 300 representatives each, while third one has 600 members who were more prosperous and educated. However, artisans, peasants, and women were denied entry to assembly. Then voting estate general has been conducted as according to past principle of each state. One vote, but members of third estate demanded for each member one vote philosophy. Due to rejection, they walked out of the assembly in protest after this. They declared themselves a national assembly and drafted a constitution for France to limit powers of monarch, which was led by Mirabeau, a noble, belonged to a noble class, and Abicius belonged to the first estate. He was a priest. Due to the power of revolt, Law 16 finally recognized the National Assembly and accepted the Constitution. And the Assembly passed a law abolishing the feudal system of obligation and taxes, death and the tails, and the members of clergy were forced to give up their privileges. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly completed the process of drafting the Constitution in 1791, aiming to limit the powers of the monarch. The powers were now separated and assigned to different institutions, the legislature, executive, and the judiciary, which made France a constitutional monarchy. The Constitution of 1791 gave the power of making laws in the hands of the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected by a group of electors, which were chosen by active citizens. Now, the active citizens comprises of only men about 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage. The remaining men and all women were classed as passive citizens who had no voting rights. You can see figure 7, the political system under the Constitution of 1791. It is clearly mentioned there. The Constitution began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. In this declaration of the rights of man and citizen, National Assembly adopted it on 26 August 1789. It declared that all men are born equal. It specified the equality of all men before the law. It asserted that every citizen has the right to aspire for the highest offices of the government. It declared freedom from arrested or punishment without proven cause, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It further stressed on the equitable distribution of the burden of taxation. It hit the prevailing European system, which was based on the privilege. It declared faith in equality, liberty, and fraternity. Thus, the declaration was a remarkable one and has been regarded as the gospel of modern time. France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. In the following years, the situation in France continued to be tense. Louis XVI entered into a secret deal with the King of Prussia. Although he signed the constitution, the developments in France became a cause of worry for the rulers of the neighboring countries. They made plans to send troops to control the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. But before any such thing could happen, a war against Prussia and Austria was declared by the National Assembly vote in April 1792. Thousands of volunteers, seeing this as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe, thronged from the provinces to join the army. Marseillaise, composed by the poet and now the national anthem of France, was sung among other patriotic songs by the volunteers for the first time as they marched into Paris. People were faced with losses and economic difficulties brought by the Revolutionary Wars. Women folks had to cope with the task of earning a living and supporting their families as the men folk had been fighting at the front. Since the people thought that the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of the society, large sections of population were of the firm view that the revolution had to be carried further. The people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of action found political clubs to be an important rallying point. Jacobins, which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris, was one of the most successful clubs at that time. There were women clubs too, which were formed by those women who had been active throughout the spirit. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins. The members of the Jacobins club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. Jacobins started wearing long striped trousers and came to be known as sans-culottes. Literally means those without knee breeches. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned a revolt of large number of the people of Paris who were angered by the short supply and high prices of food. In summer of 1792, Jacobins attacked the palace of Tuileries and captured the king for several hours. In this attack, most of the guards of the king were killed. After that election was held, the newly elected assembly was called the Convention. In the election, all men above the age of 21 got the right to vote, regardless of wealth. On 21st of September 1792, monarchy was abolished and France was declared a republic. Later, King Louis XVI and the Queen Marie Antoinette were sentenced to death. They were executed publicly at the place de la Concorde. The Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Following the king's execution, war with various European powers and intense divisions within the National Convention ushered the French Revolution into its most violent and turbulent phase. In June 1793, the Jacobins seized control of the National Convention and instituted a series of radical measures, including the establishment of a new calendar. They also unleashed the Reign of Terror, a 10-month period in which suspected enemies of the revolution were guillotined by the thousands. Many of the killings were carried out under orders from Robespierre, who dominated the Draconian Committee of Public Safety until his own execution on July 28, 1794. Now, the guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. So, it was named after Dr. Guillotin, who invented it. Even Robespierre had to face his execution on July 28, 1794. His death marked the beginning of a moderate phase in which the French people revolted against the Reign of Terror's excesses. Over 17,000 people were officially tried and executed during the Reign of Terror, and an unknown number of others died in prison or without trial. A directory rules France. Fall of the Jacobean government allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. According to the new constitution, non-propertied sections of society denied voting. It provided for two elected legislative councils. The government appointed a directory consisting of executives made up of 5 members. Political instability paved the way for a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. So, the executive power would lie in the hands of a 5 member directory appointed by Parliament. Royalists and Jacobins protested the new regime but were swiftly silenced by the army, now led by a young and successful general named Napoleon Bonaparte. The directory's 4 years in power were riddled with financial crisis, popular discontent, inefficiency, and above all political corruption. By the late 1790s, the directors relied almost entirely on the military to maintain their authority and had ceded much of their power to the generals in the field. Women in power. The role of women in revolution. Most of the historians believe that from the very beginning women were active participants in the events related with the French Revolution of 1789. Their active interest and role brought about so many important changes in French society. The French women hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They worked as domestic helpers in the houses of rich people, or they worked as laundress or seamstress, sold flowers, vegetables, and fruits at the market. Before and during the days of revolution, most of the women of France did not have access to good job training or to educational institutions. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the Third Estate could study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. So working women had to lead a very hard life because she had to work outside the houses as well as she also had to take care of her families, that is, to cook, to fetch water, cure for bread, and look after the children. So the women were paid lower wages than their male counterparts. So in order to discuss the voices, their interests, women began their own newspapers and political clubs. Nearly 60 women's clubs came up in various French towns and cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republic Women was the most famous of them. The Society of Revolutionary and Republic Women was formed in 1793 to voice its opinion and grievances against the Constitution of 1791, which denied them the right to vote. The eminent writer and political activist Olympe de Gouges opposed the Constitution and the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens of 1791. She later drafted the Declaration of Rights for Women and Citizens. She was charged with treason and was guillotined on November 2, 1793. So the revolution carried out by the women of France triggered the international suffrage movement for the next 2 centuries. As a result of this movement in 1946, the women of France won the right to exercise their franchise and equal wages. The abolition of slavery. The revolutionary France abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1794, although it was restored in 1802 by Napoleon as part of a program to ensure sovereignty over its colonies. Slavery was declared illegal in 1948 under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Before the French Revolution in 1789, France had 3 colonies of the Caribbean under its control. These places were major suppliers of sugar, coffee, indigo, and tobacco. The triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and America began in the 17th century. Merchants sailed from French ports to the African coast where they bought Negroes who are natives of Africa from the local chieftains. Port cities were flourishing economically because of the slave trade. Slavery was reintroduced in the French colonies by Napoleon Bonaparte. Slavery was finally abolished in 1848 by the French Second Republic. Everyday life and the revolution. The years after 1789 in France experienced many changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The responsibility of passing the laws translating the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice was taken up by the revolutionary governments upon themselves. One important law, the abolition of censorship, came into effect soon after the storming of Bastille in the summer of 1789. All written material and cultural activities in the old regime could be published or performed only after they were approved by the censors of the king. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen now proclaimed freedom of speech and expressions to be a natural right. Freedom of press meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. By this way, people could group and identify with ideas such as liberty, justice that political philosophers wrote about, which only a handful of educated people could read. The conclusion: Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as Emperor of France in 1804. He conquered neighboring European countries, dispossessed dynasties, created kingdoms, and placed members of his family there. Napoleon saw himself as a modernizer of Europe. Many laws, such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures, were introduced by him. Napoleon, in the initial stages, was seen as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But soon this image of Napoleon changed and he was viewed as an invader. Finally, in 1815, he was defeated at the Waterloo. Many of his revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws that he carried to many parts of Europe had an impact on the people, but after he had left. So, the revolution resulted in the suppression of the feudal system, emancipation of the individual, a greater division of landed property, abolition of the privilege of noble birth, and nominal establishment of equality among men. The revolution also witnessed the birth of total war by organizing the resources of France and the lives of its citizens towards the objective of national defense. Globally, the revolution became the focal point for the development of most modern political ideologies, leading to the spread of liberalism, radicalism, nationalism, and secularism, among many others, accelerating the rise of republics and democracies. The values and institutions of the revolution dominate French politics to this day. Many historians regard the revolution as one of the most important events in human history.